the problem with complaining is that we've taken our eyes off of God. We've taken our eyes off of God, and we put them on the things that we're dealing with. Let's think about Paul for a minute. Paul had many reasons to complain. He almost had a right to complain. If anybody had a right to complain, it was Paul. Paul, who gave his life for the gospel. Jesus called him. Paul was against the church, but when Jesus called him, he called him into the ministry and told him to go to the Gentiles, probably the hardest assignment at that time. Paul met opposition everywhere he went, opposed. He was stoned, he was thrown out of town, he was beaten. They thought he was dead multiple times. Many reasons to complain, but you see, Paul, every time he got into a place where he could complain, he chose to see Jesus. He chose to not look at himself, but to see Jesus and the purpose for his life. Look at Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. Now you have to remember that Paul wrote this when he was in prison. Paul was in prison and he wrote this. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And as a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ." So he wasn't complaining to Christ that Christ put him in the chains. He believed that he was serving God's purpose by being chained to this Roman guard in prison. How could Paul be in prison facing possible execution and rejoice? Same way he and Silas at midnight, in the dark of midnight in prison, began to sing praises to God and rejoice. Because Paul chose not to look at himself, but to look at Jesus. He did not take his eyes off of Jesus. He did not begin to look at his situation and complain. "Oh, every time I preach, I get thrown in jail. Every time I preach, they beat me to death. I'm going to stop. I'm going to quit. This is not worth it. To save my life, I'll have to turn my back on what God's called me to do." Paul didn't. He kept his eyes focused on Jesus.